Welcome to Night Shift Hauntings. Before we check in tonight, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now get comfortable. The night shift is about to begin.
The Patterson file was there again, centered perfectly on my desk, like an accusation. The fluorescent lights in the basement morgue hummed their familiar tune as I settled into another quiet Tuesday evening shift. After 15 years as the county coroner, I'd grown accustomed to the solitude that came with death's paperwork. The living world above continued its frantic dance while I maintained meticulous order in the realm below, filing reports, updating databases, ensuring that each soul received their proper documentation before their final rest. My desk sat positioned strategically between the examination tables and the refrigerated storage units, a command center where I could monitor both the incoming cases and the administrative requirements that kept our department functioning. The county had been experiencing a particularly busy month, with an unusual uptick in sudden deaths that kept my assistant Rebecca working overtime during the day shifts. By evening, however, the morgue returned to its natural state of peaceful efficiency. It was during one of these quiet nights that I first noticed the Patterson file. The manila folder appeared on my desk sometime between my coffee break and the completion of my weekly inventory report. Nothing unusual about that. Rebecca often left pending cases for my evening review. What struck me as odd was the incomplete nature of the documentation. The basic information was there. Male, approximately 45 years old, found deceased in his apartment by a concerned neighbor. But the fields for next of kin, medical history, and cause of death remained conspicuously blank. I made a mental note to discuss the missing information with Rebecca in the morning and filed the folder in my pending tray. The next evening, however, the same folder sat prominently on my desk again, positioned directly in the center, as if someone had deliberately placed it there for my immediate attention. This time, I examined the contents more carefully. The deceased's name was listed as David Patterson, and included with the file was a photograph that made me pause. Something about the man's face seemed familiar, though I couldn't immediately place where I might have encountered him. His features held a quality that suggested I should remember him, like encountering someone from a half-forgotten dream. Over the following weeks, the Patterson file continued its mysterious appearances. Each time I filed it away or locked it in my desk drawer, it would materialize again by the next evening, always positioned with the same deliberate prominence. More disturbing was the gradual changes I began to notice in the photograph. The image seemed sharper somehow, more detailed, as if the camera that captured it was slowly adjusting its focus. My investigation into David Patterson's background yielded frustratingly little information. The address listed on his file led to an apartment building that had been demolished 3 years prior. The phone number connected to a disconnected line. Most unsettling of all, when I searched our database for similar cases, I discovered a pattern that made my hands tremble as I typed. Over the past 6 months, 7 other cases had crossed my desk with remarkably similar circumstances. Middle-aged men, found alone in their residences, with incomplete documentation and that same elusive quality of familiarity in their photographs. I pulled each file from our archives and spread them across my desk under the harsh fluorescent lighting. The faces stared back at me with increasing clarity, and slowly, terrifyingly, I began to recognize them. There was Michael Hendricks, who had been my lab partner during my first year of medical school before he'd transferred to a different program. James Morrison, a fellow resident who had worked the night shift at the hospital where I'd completed my internship. Robert Carlyle, who had been present during my first autopsy, the one that had convinced me to specialize in forensic pathology. Each man represented a different chapter of my professional development. Faces from a past I'd gradually forgotten as the years of morgue work had dulled my memory of the living world above. But here they were, processed through my own department. Their deaths as methodically documented as everything else that passed through these sterile halls. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow. These weren't coincidences. Someone, or something, was systematically presenting me with the corpses of people from my past, each one processed through the very system I had spent my career perfecting. I began staying later each evening, obsessively reviewing the files and searching for connections I might have missed. The morgue's silence, once comforting, now felt oppressive. Every small sound, the hum of the refrigeration units, the settling of the building's old bones, seemed amplified in the growing darkness of my paranoia. It was during one of these extended vigils that I discovered the most disturbing detail of all. While cross-referencing the dates of death with my own employment records, I noticed that each man had died within weeks of major milestones in my career. Michael Hendricks had died 3 days after I'd received my medical degree. James Morrison's death occurred just 5 days after I'd been hired as the county coroner. The pattern continued with mathematical precision, as if my professional advancement was somehow connected to their systematic elimination. The Patterson file appeared on my desk again that night, but this time it wasn't empty. Someone had completed the missing fields in handwriting that looked disturbingly similar to my own. Under cause of death, the report now read, cardiac arrest following prolonged exposure to memories of professional inadequacy. In the next of kin field, a single name was listed, Alan Hayes. As I stared at the completed form, details began flooding back with terrible clarity. David Patterson hadn't been just a passing acquaintance from my past. He had been my supervisor during my first week as a coroner's assistant 20 years ago. He had been the one to show me the proper procedures for handling the deceased, the one who had taught me to maintain emotional distance from the bodies that crossed our tables. He had also been the one to die in a car accident just 3 days after I'd submitted my application for promotion to his position. The other faces on my desk began to make sense with sickening clarity. Each one had been someone who had stood between me and the next step in my career. Each one had died under circumstances that had directly benefited my professional advancement. And each one had been processed through this very morgue, under my own signature, with documentation that I had completed myself. But the most terrifying realization was yet to come. As I examined my own handwriting on the Patterson file, I noticed something that made my blood freeze in my veins. The timestamp on the form indicated it had been completed 3 weeks ago, 3 weeks before David Patterson had supposedly died. I pulled out a mirror from my desk drawer and held it up. Beside the photograph in the Patterson file, the face that stared back at me was older, more weathered by years of working in the basement shadows. But the resemblance was unmistakable. David Patterson looked exactly like I had 20 years ago, before the morgue had changed me into something else entirely. The files scattered across my desk weren't records of the dead. They were documentation of the man I had been, systematically eliminated and processed through the very system I thought I controlled. Each promotion, each advancement in my career, had required the death of my former self, until nothing remained but the efficient, methodical creature that now inhabited this basement realm. As I write this final entry in my logbook, I can hear Rebecca's footsteps echoing in the hallway above. Tomorrow morning, she'll find a new file on her desk, one bearing my own name and photograph. The cause of death will be listed as complete professional transformation, and she'll process it with the same careful attention to detail that I taught her. Some records, I've come to understand, document more than just the end of life. They chronicle the systematic dismantling of identity itself, filed away in the basement of memory where the living world above never thinks to look. And sometimes when a body arrives without any identification, it carries the most important message of all. The body had no fingerprints, no dental records, no identifying marks, and somehow it knew my name. 23 years of forensic pathology had taught me that every corpse tells a story. The accumulated evidence of a lifetime etches itself into flesh and bone, creating a roadmap that skilled hands can read like scripture. Scars reveal childhood accidents, dental work indicates socioeconomic status, and tattoos provide windows into personality and relationships. In my sterile examination room at the state medical examiner's office, I had become fluent in the language of the dead, which is why the unmarked cadaver disturbed me so profoundly. The body arrived on a Thursday morning in October, delivered by the county transport team with the standard paperwork indicating it had been discovered in a vacant lot on the outskirts of town. Female, approximately 35 years old, no obvious signs of trauma or violence. The routine nature of the delivery should have prepared me for another standard examination, but as soon as the transport team departed, I knew this case would be different. The woman's body lay on the examination table with an unusual quality of preservation that immediately caught my attention. Her skin retained a healthy color that contradicted the reported discovery timeline, and her hair maintained a lustrous quality that suggested recent professional care. Most striking, however, was the complete absence of any identifying characteristics. I began my examination with the standard external assessment, photographing and measuring every inch of the subject. No scars, no birthmarks, no tattoos, nothing that would distinguish this woman from any other person of similar age and build. Her hands were smooth and uncalloused, suggesting a life free from manual labor. But when I attempted to collect fingerprints, I discovered something that violated every principle of forensic science I had ever learned. The woman had no fingerprints, not damaged or burned away, simply absent. The tips of her fingers were completely smooth, as if she had been born without the unique ridges and whorls that identify every human being. I repeated the process multiple times, using different techniques and equipment, but the results remained consistently impossible. The dental examination proved equally fruitless. Her teeth were perfect, no fillings, no crowns, no orthodontic work. But more disturbing was the complete absence of any dental records matching her description in any database I could access. It was as if this woman had lived her entire life without ever requiring medical or dental care, leaving no paper trail of her existence. As the days passed, my investigation into the woman's identity consumed more and more of my time. I ran DNA samples through every available database, contacted missing person bureaus across multiple states, and even reached out to international agencies. Each inquiry returned the same result: no matches found. The case began to affect my sleep. I would lie awake at night, thinking about the woman's face and the serene expression she wore in death. There was something hauntingly familiar about her features, though I couldn't place where I might have encountered her. The feeling grew stronger each time I returned to the examination room, until I found myself spending entire lunch breaks simply staring at her peaceful countenance. It was during one of these extended observations that I noticed the first change. The woman's position on the table had shifted slightly. Nothing dramatic. Her head had turned perhaps an inch to the right, and her left arm had moved closer to her body. I initially attributed the change to the natural settling of tissue, but when I checked the photographs from my initial examination, the difference was undeniable. I began documenting these subtle changes with obsessive precision, taking photographs every few hours and maintaining detailed logs of the body's positioning. The alterations continued with disturbing regularity, always small movements that could be dismissed as imagination or natural decomposition, but collectively creating a pattern that suggested something far more unsettling. The woman was slowly turning to face the door of the examination room, the door through which I entered each morning. My investigation into the discovery site yielded no additional information. The vacant lot had been empty for years, with no witnesses to the body's placement and no evidence of how it had arrived there. The responding officers described finding the woman lying peacefully on her back, as if she had simply chosen that location for an afternoon nap. It was while reviewing the crime scene photographs that I made a discovery that caused my hands to shake uncontrollably. In the background of one image, partially obscured by tall grass, stood a small wooden sign that I had initially overlooked. When I enlarged and enhanced the photograph, the faded lettering became clearly visible. Carter Family Cemetery, established 1892. My maiden name was Carter. My great-great-grandfather had established that family cemetery over a century ago, and I had visited it frequently as a child with my grandmother. The woman had been discovered less than 50 yards from where my ancestors were buried. The revelation sent me rushing to my grandmother's old photo albums, stored in my attic since her death 5 years earlier. I spread the yellowed pictures across my kitchen table, searching for any connection to the mysterious woman. Most of the photographs were formal portraits of relatives I had never met, stern-faced ancestors in period clothing who stared at the camera with the gravity appropriate to the era. It was in the final album that I found what I was looking for. The photograph was dated 1987, the year I was born. It showed a young woman standing in front of the Carter family cemetery, her face partially obscured by shadows, but her posture and build unmistakably familiar. According to my grandmother's careful notations, the woman was my Aunt Sarah. my father's younger sister who had disappeared when I was just a few months old. I had no memory of Sarah, as she had vanished before I was old enough to form lasting impressions. Family conversations about her were rare and uncomfortable, with relatives changing the subject whenever her name was mentioned. I had grown up understanding that Sarah's disappearance was a source of pain that the family preferred not to discuss. But now, 35 years later, Sarah had returned. I compared the photograph to the woman on my examination table, noting the identical bone structure, the same delicate hands, even the same way of holding her head at a slight angle. The age progression was perfect. Sarah would have been exactly 35 years old if she had lived. The implications of this discovery terrified me more than any case I had ever worked. If the woman was indeed my Aunt Sarah, how had she remained perfectly preserved for over 3 decades? Where had she been during the years of my childhood, my education, my career development? And most disturbing of all, why had she chosen to appear now in my examination room, under circumstances that defied every law of forensic science? I returned to the morgue that evening with my grandmother's photograph, intent on making a definitive comparison. The examination room was dark except for the emergency lighting, casting long shadows across the tile floor. As I approached the table where Sarah's body lay, I noticed that her position had changed again. She was now lying on her side, facing the door, her eyes wide open and staring directly at the entrance. I fumbled for the light switch, my heart pounding with a rhythm that seemed to echo through the empty building. When the fluorescent lights flickered to life, Sarah's body had returned to its original position, but something had changed in her expression. The serene look of death had been replaced by something else, a slight smile that suggested she had been waiting for me to make the connection. I placed my grandmother's photograph on the table beside Sarah's head, comparing the two faces under the harsh examination lights. They were identical in every detail, down to a small scar above the left eyebrow that I had initially attributed to post-mortem damage. As I stared at the comparison, Sarah's eyes opened, not the gradual, natural movement of muscles relaxing, but the deliberate action of someone awakening from sleep. She looked directly at me with eyes that held 35 years of patience, 35 years of waiting for this moment of recognition. "Hello, Lila," she said in a voice that carried the weight of decades. "I've been waiting for you to grow up." The revelation that followed unfolded like a carefully rehearsed presentation. Sarah explained that she had never disappeared. She had been watching, waiting, preparing for the moment when I would be skilled enough to understand the truth about our family. The Carter family cemetery wasn't just a burial ground for our ancestors. It was a way station for those who had chosen to exist between life and death, guardians who protected the living members of our bloodline. She had spent 35 years learning to navigate this liminal space, mastering the ability to appear and disappear at will, to exist without leaving traces in the world of the living. Her body bore no fingerprints because she no longer belonged entirely to the physical world. Her DNA appeared in no databases because she had transcended the need for such earthly identification. And now, she explained with that same patient smile, it was my turn to join her. The morgue around us began to shift and change, the sterile examination room transforming into something that resembled the Carter family cemetery. The fluorescent lights dimmed to the soft glow of twilight, and I could hear the distant sound of wind moving through old trees. As I write these final notes in my examination log, I can feel the transformation beginning. My fingerprints are already starting to fade, my reflection growing dim in the polished surfaces of my instruments. Tomorrow, my colleagues will find an empty examination room and a case file describing an unidentified woman who was never really there at all. But I understand now that some identities transcend the physical markers we use to define ourselves. Sometimes the most important connections exist in the spaces between life and death, where unmarked bodies carry the deepest truths about who we really are. And sometimes when a mysterious caller reaches across the void, they're not seeking identification, they're offering it. The phone always rang at 11:47 p.m., and the bodies would turn their heads toward the sound. Working the night shift at County General's morgue had given me a particular appreciation for routine. In the 3 years since I'd taken the position as morgue assistant, I'd grown comfortable with the predictable rhythm of my duties: inventory checks at 10 p.m., temperature logs every 2 hours, and the careful maintenance of the facility's various systems that kept our silent residents in their proper state of preservation. The phone calls began during my second week of November, coinciding with the hospital's installation of a new communication system that was supposed to improve efficiency between departments. The old intercom network had been replaced with individual phones in each area, including our basement facility, where such improvements seemed unnecessary given our limited need for outside contact during overnight hours. The first call came exactly 12 minutes before midnight, as I was completing my evening inventory of the refrigerated storage units. The shrill ring of the unfamiliar phone cut through the morgue's customary silence with jarring intensity. I answered on the third ring, expecting to hear from the night supervisor or perhaps an emergency room physician requiring information about a recent admission. Instead, I was greeted by complete silence, not the silence of a disconnected line, but the deliberate quiet of someone listening on the other end. I could hear the faint sound of breathing, measured and patient, as if the caller was waiting for me to speak first. After several moments, I identified myself and asked how I could be of assistance, but the only response was the soft click of the line disconnecting. I noted the incident in my shift log and returned to my duties, assuming it had been a misdirected call or perhaps someone testing the new phone system. But the next night, at precisely the same time, the phone rang again with the same result: silence, breathing, and eventual disconnection. By the end of the week, the nightly calls had become part of my routine. I would pause my work at 11:45 p.m. and wait for the inevitable ring, answer with professional courtesy, listen to the breathing for exactly 90 seconds, and then resume my duties after the caller hung up. The consistency of the timing and duration suggested a deliberate pattern rather than random misdials. It was during the second week of calls that I began to notice the subtle changes in the bodies. The morgue typically housed between 8 and 12 subjects at any given time, depending on the flow of cases through the medical examiner's office. These individuals lay in our refrigerated units with the dignified stillness appropriate to their circumstances, positioned according to standard protocols that I had learned to maintain with meticulous precision. But on the night of November 18th, as the phone rang with its customary punctuality, I observed something that made me question my own perception. The body nearest to the phone, an elderly gentleman who had arrived that afternoon following a peaceful passing at the nursing home, appeared to have turned his head slightly toward the sound. I initially dismissed the observation as a trick of the harsh fluorescent lighting, but over the following nights, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Each time the phone rang, the bodies in the morgue would shift almost imperceptibly in the direction of the sound, as if they were listening to something I couldn't hear. The movements were subtle enough that they could be attributed to natural settling of tissue, but their timing was too precise to be coincidental. I began documenting these observations with photographic evidence, taking pictures before and after each nightly call to track the changes in positioning. The evidence was undeniable. The bodies were responding to the phone calls. My investigation into the new phone system's installation revealed that our basement extension had been connected to a number that had previously belonged to a different department. The facilities manager, a helpful woman named Carol who had worked at the hospital for over 20 years, was able to trace the number's history through her detailed records. The number had originally been assigned to the pediatric ward's family consultation room, where doctors would make the most difficult calls of their careers, informing parents about the loss of their children. The room had been converted to storage 3 years earlier, when the pediatric ward was relocated to a different wing, but the phone line had remained active in the system until the recent upgrade. This revelation prompted me to delve deeper into the hospital's records, searching for any connection between the pediatric ward's history and the current situation in the morgue. What I discovered in the archived files made my hands shake as I read through the documentation. Dr. Marcus Webb had been the head of pediatric oncology for 15 years, before his retirement in 2019. According to his personnel file, Dr. Webb had made it his personal practice to personally call the families of every child who passed away under his care, often making these calls late in the evening from the consultation room to allow families time to process the news privately. The timing of these calls, I noted with growing unease, had typically occurred around midnight. Further research revealed that Dr. Webb had been admitted to our hospital 6 months earlier following a stroke. and had remained in a comatose state until his death just 2 weeks ago. His body had been one of the first to occupy our morgue following the installation of the new phone system. Dr. Webb's body had been claimed by his family and buried 5 days earlier. But the calls had continued every night since his departure. The realization that struck me was both logical and terrifying. The calls weren't coming from outside the morgue. They were originating from within our own facility, from a source that no longer required physical equipment to make contact. I began staying closer to the phone during the nightly calls, listening more carefully to the silence on the other end. What I had initially interpreted as breathing was actually something else, a rhythmic sound that resembled the beeping of medical equipment, the kind of life support systems that had surrounded Dr. Webb during his final weeks. On the night of November 30th, exactly 3 weeks after the calls began, I decided to break protocol. Instead of simply answering and waiting for the disconnection, I spoke directly to whatever presence was on the other end. "Dr. Webb," I said into the receiver, "I know it's you." The silence that followed was different, more attentive, more focused. I could sense a shift in the quality of the connection, as if my acknowledgement had somehow strengthened the link between us. "You're still making your calls," I continued. "But there are no families to comfort here, only the bodies of those who no longer need your care." The response, when it came, was not a voice but a series of clicks and static that gradually resolved into a pattern I recognized. It was Morse code, tapped out with the same patient precision that Dr. Webb had once used to explain difficult diagnoses to worried parents. The message was simple and heartbreaking. Still here. Still helping. Can't stop. Over the following nights, I learned to communicate with Dr. Webb through this improvised system of clicks and pauses. He explained in his methodical way that death had not released him from his sense of duty. The children he had lost during his career remained with him, and he continued to feel responsible for their comfort, even in this liminal space between life and death. The bodies in the morgue, he revealed, were not simply responding to the phone calls. They were listening to the voices of the children who accompanied him, young spirits who gathered around Dr. Webb each night as he continued his eternal rounds. The calls, I realized, were not ghostly intrusions but acts of compassion. Dr. Webb was checking on each body in our care, ensuring that no one faced the transition alone, just as he had done for countless families during his living years. As I write this entry in my shift log, I can hear the familiar sound of the phone beginning to ring. It's 11:47 p.m. and Dr. Webb is making his rounds. The bodies around me shift slightly, turning toward the sound with the same trust they once placed in medical professionals during their final moments. Tomorrow night, I'll answer the call with the respect it deserves, and I'll listen to the messages Dr. Webb taps out for each of our residents. Because I've learned that some duties transcend death, and some calls are too important to ignore. But I've also begun to notice something else in the pattern of those Morse code messages. Coordinates, dates and names that don't match anyone currently in our care. Dr. Webb isn't just caring for the bodies we house. He's documenting the ones we haven't found yet. The faces that haven't yet appeared on our examination tables, but soon will. Their faces all wore the same expression, a look of absolute terror that death should have erased, but somehow preserved with crystalline clarity. The art of post-mortem examination requires a particular kind of emotional detachment that most people find difficult to understand. During my 8 years as an autopsy technician at the State Forensic Laboratory, I had developed the professional distance necessary to perform my duties with clinical precision. Bodies arrived on my table as puzzles to be solved, their stories written in the language of tissue damage, toxicology reports, and physiological evidence. This methodical approach had served me well through hundreds of cases, from routine natural deaths to complex homicide investigations. I took pride in my ability to assist the pathologists with thorough, objective examinations that helped families find closure and law enforcement agencies pursue justice. The dead, I had learned, deserved the same professional courtesy as the living, perhaps more so given their inability to advocate for themselves. The pattern began in early December, with a series of cases that initially appeared unrelated but shared one disturbing characteristic that gradually demanded my attention. The first body was that of Thomas Brennan, a 42-year-old accountant who had been found dead in his home office by his wife. The initial scene investigation suggested a heart attack. He was discovered slumped over his desk with no signs of violence or struggle. But when I began my preliminary examination, I was struck by the expression frozen on his face. His eyes were wide with unmistakable terror, his mouth slightly open as if he had been screaming at the moment of death. The facial muscles had locked in this position with rigor mortis, preserving an expression of fear so intense that it seemed to radiate from the examination table. I documented the facial expression with careful photography and measurements, noting its unusual preservation in my technical report. While sudden cardiac events could occasionally result in distressed facial expressions, the degree of terror displayed by Mr. Brennan was extreme enough to warrant special attention. 3 days later, I received the body of Margaret Sullivan, a 60-year-old librarian who had died during her morning walk through the local park. Witnesses described seeing her suddenly collapse while feeding ducks at the pond, with no apparent cause or precipitating event. The preliminary diagnosis was stroke, a reasonable assumption given her age and medical history, but Margaret Sullivan's face bore the exact same expression of terror that I had observed in Thomas Brennan. The similarity was too precise to be coincidental. Both bodies displayed identical positioning of the facial muscles, the same widening of the eyes, the same slight parting of the lips. It was as if they had both seen something in their final moments that had frozen them in a state of absolute horror. Over the following 2 weeks, 4 more bodies arrived with variations of the same terrified expression. Each case appeared to be a natural death, heart attacks, strokes, respiratory failure. But all 6 individuals had died with their faces locked in identical masks of fear. I brought my observations to Dr. Amanda Reeves, the chief pathologist who supervised our laboratory. Dr. Reeves had been my mentor since I'd begun working at the facility, and I respected her analytical approach to unusual patterns in our caseload. She listened to my presentation with the careful attention she brought to all potential anomalies. Facial expressions at the time of death can be misleading, she explained, pulling up the case files on her computer screen. What appears to be terror might simply be the result of respiratory distress or cardiac pain. We need to focus on the physiological evidence rather than subjective interpretations of facial positioning. But as we reviewed the toxicology reports and tissue samples together, Dr. Reeves acknowledged that the cases shared several unusual characteristics beyond the facial expressions. All 6 individuals had died with extremely elevated levels of adrenaline and cortisol, stress hormones that suggested they had experienced intense fear immediately before death. More puzzling was the complete absence of any external cause for this terror. None of the bodies showed signs of violence, poisoning, or environmental hazards. They had simply died of fear itself, with no identifiable source for the emotion that had killed them. I began my own investigation into the backgrounds of the 6 victims, looking for connections that might explain their shared fate. The individuals came from different neighborhoods, social circles, and professional backgrounds. Their ages ranged from 38 to 65, with no apparent common threads in their medical histories or personal relationships. But as I dug deeper into their recent activities, I discovered one significant connection that made my blood run cold. All 6 victims had been patients of Dr. Harold Ashworth, a psychiatrist who had recently opened a private practice specializing in trauma therapy and phobia treatment. Each of the deceased had been receiving treatment from Dr. Ashworth for various anxiety disorders, Thomas Brennan for work-related stress, Margaret Sullivan for social phobia, and the others for similar conditions. Dr. Ashworth had been my professor during my undergraduate studies in forensic science. Before I decided to pursue technical training rather than medical school, he had been an inspiring teacher, known for his innovative approaches to understanding the psychological aspects of death and dying. His lectures on the intersection of mental health and forensic pathology had influenced my decision to specialize in this field. The revelation that my former professor was connected to these mysterious deaths created a conflict between my professional obligations and personal loyalty. I struggled with the decision to pursue this line of investigation, knowing that it could implicate someone who had played a significant role in shaping my career, but the arrival of the 7th body forced my hand. Janet Morrison was a 29-year-old graduate student who had been found dead in her apartment with the same expression of terror that had marked all the previous cases. Her roommate reported that Janet had been receiving treatment from Dr. Ashworth for panic disorder and had mentioned feeling unusually anxious after her most recent session. I decided to attend Janet's autopsy personally, assisting Dr. Reeves with the examination while paying particular attention to any evidence that might explain the pattern we were observing. The external examination revealed the familiar signs: the wide eyes, the open mouth, the facial muscles locked in an expression of absolute horror. But it was during the internal examination that we made the discovery that changed everything. Hidden beneath Janet's tongue, Dr. Reeves found a small electronic device about the size of a hearing aid battery. The device was unlike anything either of us had encountered in our years of forensic work, a sophisticated piece of technology that appeared to be designed for subcutaneous implantation. We carefully extracted the device and sent it to the laboratory's electronics specialist for analysis. The results, when they arrived the following day, revealed the true horror of what we had uncovered. The device was a prototype neural stimulator designed to trigger specific fear responses in the human brain through targeted electrical impulses. According to the technical specifications, it could be activated remotely and programmed to induce varying levels of terror, from mild anxiety to the kind of overwhelming fear that could cause cardiac arrest. Armed with this evidence, I contacted the police and provided them with the information linking Dr. Ashworth to all 7 victims. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of his activities and the motivation behind his crimes. Dr. Ashworth had been conducting illegal experiments on his patients, using them as test subjects for his research into fear-based therapies. He had been implanting the neural stimulators during routine office visits, telling patients they were receiving vitamin injections or minor dental work. The devices allowed him to monitor and manipulate his subjects' fear responses from a distance, gathering data for research he intended to publish in psychiatric journals. But the experiments had gone wrong. The fear responses he was inducing proved to be more intense than he had anticipated, causing the physiological stress that led to his patients' deaths. Rather than discontinuing the research, he had continued to refine his techniques, treating each death as a data point in his ongoing study. The police arrested Dr. Ashworth at his office, where they found detailed records of his experiments and the remote controls he used to activate the neural stimulators. His computer contained video recordings of his patients' final moments, captured through hidden cameras in their homes and workplaces. He had been watching them die, documenting their expressions of terror for his research. During his interrogation, Dr. Ashworth showed no remorse for his actions. He described his victims as willing participants in groundbreaking research that would revolutionize the treatment of anxiety disorders. The fact that they had died during the process was, in his view, an acceptable cost for the advancement of medical science. But it was his final statement that revealed the true depth of his delusion and the extent of the danger he represented. The expressions on their faces, he told the investigating officers, were perfect representations of pure, undiluted fear. I was able to capture the exact moment when the human mind confronts its own mortality and finds itself unable to cope. That data is invaluable for understanding the psychological mechanisms that control our response to death. He paused, looking directly at the camera recording his confession, and smiled with the same calm professionalism I remembered from his lectures. Of course, the real breakthrough will come when I can observe the fear response in someone who truly understands what's happening to them. Someone with the training to appreciate the clinical significance of their own terror. As I watched the recording of this confession, I realized that Dr. Ashworth was looking directly at me through the camera, his smile growing wider as he spoke those final words. That night, I discovered a small puncture wound behind my left ear that I didn't remember receiving. The wound was healing, but it was exactly the right size for the insertion of a neural stimulator. As I write this report, I can feel a strange tingling sensation in my skull, and my heart rate has begun to increase despite my efforts to remain calm. The fluorescent lights in the laboratory seem brighter than usual, and every small sound makes me jump with an intensity that feels artificially amplified. I know that Dr. Ashworth is monitoring me now, waiting for the perfect moment to activate whatever device he implanted during one of our recent conversations about the case. I can feel his presence watching me, measuring my responses, preparing to collect the data that will complete his research. But I also know that I have one advantage he didn't account for. Unlike his other victims, I understand exactly what's happening to me, and I've prepared my own final experiment. Hidden in my desk is a detailed record of his methods and a complete confession that will ensure his conviction, regardless of what happens to me. The only question now is whether my professional training will allow me to observe my own death with the same clinical detachment I've brought to hundreds of other cases. Some faces, I suspect, are meant to carry their terror into whatever lies beyond the examination table. The crying started 3 days after I embalmed little Emma Patterson, and it came from the storage cooler where no one living should have been able to make a sound. 37 years in the mortuary business had taught me to distinguish between the sounds of the living world and the settling of the dead. The old Victorian house that served as Grimes' family funeral home had its own vocabulary of creaks and sighs, sounds that spoke of wood aging and foundations shifting with the seasons. I had grown comfortable with these familiar noises during my evening work, when the parlor was closed to visitors and I could focus on the technical aspects of my profession. The crying was different. It began on a Thursday evening in late November, as I was completing the preparation of Mrs. Helen Bradford, an elderly woman who had passed peacefully in her sleep at the nursing home. The sound reached me as I was washing my instruments in the preparation room, a soft, rhythmic sobbing that seemed to echo from the refrigerated storage area where we kept bodies awaiting services. At first, I assumed the sound was coming from outside the building. The funeral home sat on a corner lot in the older section of town, surrounded by houses where families lived their daily lives. Children cried, adults argued, and televisions played late into the night. The sounds of human emotion were part of the neighborhood's normal rhythm. But as I listened more carefully, the crying clearly originated from within the building, specifically from the direction of our storage facility. I had been alone in the funeral home since 6 o'clock, when my assistant Janet had finished her duties and departed for the day. The front doors were locked, the alarm system was set, and I had personally checked each room to ensure that no visitors or staff members remained on the premises. The building was secure and empty except for the bodies in our care. The crying continued for approximately 20 minutes, then stopped as abruptly as it had begun. I noted the incident in my daily log but attributed it to acoustic tricks caused by the building's age and the sound dampening effects of the preparation room. Old houses could channel sounds in unexpected ways, and it was possible that external noise had been amplified and directed through our ventilation system. The next evening, the crying resumed at approximately the same time, with the same duration and intensity. This time I left my workstation and walked to the storage area to investigate the source more directly. The refrigerated units hummed their normal mechanical song, maintaining the precise temperature required for preservation. Each unit held its assigned occupant in dignified stillness, secured behind stainless steel doors that sealed out the warmth and complications of the living world. I checked each unit methodically, ensuring that the seals were intact and the systems functioning properly. Everything appeared normal, but the crying continued. The sound seemed to emanate from Unit 3, which currently housed Emma Patterson, a 7-year-old girl who had been brought to us 3 days earlier following a tragic accident. Emma's case had been particularly difficult for me, as preparing children for their final rest always challenged my professional detachment. Her parents had requested an open casket service, which required extensive restorative work to repair the damage from her injuries. I had spent considerable time ensuring that Emma looked peaceful and natural, using techniques refined over decades of practice to give her family one last opportunity to see her as she had been in life. The work had been emotionally demanding, but I took pride in providing that final comfort to grieving parents. Now, standing outside Unit 3, I could hear the crying more clearly than ever before. It was the sound of a child weeping, soft, heartbroken sobs that seemed to come from someone who had lost everything and found no comfort in the world. I opened the unit and examined Emma's body with clinical precision. Her positioning remained exactly as I had arranged it, her hands folded peacefully across her chest, her face serene in the artificial peace of death. The embalming process had been successful, and there were no signs of decomposition or disturbance. But as I stood there in the cold air of the storage unit, looking down at Emma's still form, I heard something that made my hands tremble with a fear I had never experienced in nearly 4 decades of working with the dead. The crying was coming from Emma herself, not from her throat or mouth, which remained closed and still, but from somewhere deeper within her preserved form. The sound seemed to originate from her chest cavity, as if her heart was still beating with the rhythm of sorrow, pumping grief through arteries that no longer carried blood. I closed the unit immediately and retreated to my office, where I sat in the familiar comfort of my desk chair and tried to rationalize what I had experienced. Gases could be released from decomposing tissue, creating sounds that might be mistaken for voices. The embalming process sometimes produced unexpected results, especially in cases involving trauma, but Emma Patterson had been embalmed perfectly, using techniques that should have prevented any such complications. Over the following week, the crying became a nightly occurrence. Emma would begin sobbing around 9 o'clock each evening, continue for exactly 23 minutes, then fall silent until the next night. I began timing the episodes, documenting their consistency, and searching for rational explanations. My investigation into Emma's background revealed details that made the situation even more disturbing. According to her parents, Emma had been afraid of the dark and suffered from separation anxiety. She had never slept alone, always requiring the comfort of her parents or siblings nearby. The accident that had killed her occurred while she was alone in her room for the first time, having finally agreed to try sleeping by herself. The realization struck me with horrible clarity. Emma was crying because she was alone in the cold darkness of the storage unit, separated from everyone she loved, trapped in a body that could no longer respond to comfort. I began staying with Emma during her crying episodes, sitting beside Unit 3 and speaking to her in the gentle tones I had once used with my own children when they were young. I told her stories about the flowers her parents had chosen for her service, described the beautiful dress they had selected for her to wear, and assured her that she would see her family again soon. The crying gradually became softer, less desperate, as if my presence provided some measure of comfort. But other changes began to manifest as well. Emma's body started to shift position within the storage unit. Each morning, I would find her in a slightly different pose, sometimes curled on her side as if trying to get comfortable, other times with her arms reaching toward the door as if asking to be held. The night before Emma's funeral service, I made a decision that violated every protocol of my profession, but felt absolutely necessary for reasons I couldn't fully explain. I removed Emma from the storage unit and placed her in the smallest of our viewing rooms, surrounded by the flowers her parents had chosen and lit by the warm light of table lamps rather than the harsh fluorescence of the preparation area. That night, for the first time since the crying had begun, Emma was silent. Her funeral service the following day was beautiful and peaceful. Her parents were able to say their goodbyes with dignity, and I was able to provide them with the comfort that my profession exists to offer. Emma was laid to rest in the children's section of Restwood Cemetery, surrounded by small graves marked with toys and flowers. But as I write this entry in my daily log, I can hear new sounds coming from the storage area. Different voices, different stories of loss and loneliness. Because I've learned that some cries can never be silenced by embalming fluid or professional procedures. They can only be answered with the kind of human compassion that transcends the boundary between life and death. And sometimes, the most important reflections come from those who can no longer see themselves in any mirror, except the tears of the living. The reflection in the observation window showed me standing alone, but I could see 2 bodies on the table behind me, and I had only brought in one. The basement morgue at Metropolitan General had been my workplace for 14 months, a sterile environment where polished surfaces reflected everything with clinical clarity. Glass observation windows, stainless steel examination tables, and mirror-bright instrument trays created a world of doubled images where every action was reflected back with perfect precision. I had grown accustomed to working in this hall of mirrors, using the reflective surfaces to monitor my work from multiple angles as I assisted the pathologist with their examinations. My duties as a morgue technician required meticulous attention to detail and absolute accuracy in the handling of human remains. Each body that arrived in our facility received careful documentation, precise positioning, and respectful treatment throughout the examination process. The reflective surfaces around me served as witnesses to my professionalism, ensuring that every procedure was conducted with the dignity appropriate to the circumstances. The anomalies in the reflections began subtly, so gradually that I initially attributed them to fatigue or the effects of working long hours under fluorescent lighting. It started with discrepancies in the positioning of bodies on the examination tables. While preparing for Dr. Sarah Chen's morning autopsies, I would position a subject according to standard protocols, but the reflection in the observation window would show the body in a slightly different pose. The differences were minor, a hand positioned differently, a head turned at a different angle, but consistent enough to make me question my own perception. I began paying closer attention to these reflected images, using them as a cross-check for my work. If the reflection showed something different from what I observed directly, I would adjust the positioning to match what I saw in the mirror. But this approach led to an unsettling discovery. When I moved the body to match its reflection, the direct view would show the correct positioning while the reflection would shift to display something else entirely. The reflections were operating independently of reality. My investigation into this phenomenon led me to examine every reflective surface in the morgue with scientific precision. I tested different lighting conditions, checked for optical distortions in the glass, and even consulted with the hospital's maintenance staff about potential issues with the observation windows. Every technical explanation failed to account for what I was observing. The reflections weren't simply showing different positions, they were showing different scenes entirely. While working alone during evening shifts, I would catch glimpses of additional figures in the reflected images. The mirrors would show people standing beside the examination tables, individuals who weren't present in the actual room. These reflected figures appeared to be examining the bodies with professional interest, taking notes and conducting procedures that I couldn't observe directly. At first, I assumed these figures were reflections of myself from different angles, distorted by the complex arrangement of mirrors and glass surfaces throughout the facility. But as I observed more carefully, I realized that the reflected figures were dressed differently than I was, moved with different gestures, and appeared to be conducting examinations according to protocols I didn't recognize. The breakthrough came during my shift on December 15th, while I was preparing the body of Gregory Walsh, a construction worker who had died in an industrial accident. As I positioned Mr. Walsh on the examination table, I noticed that his reflection showed significant differences from his actual appearance. In the direct view, Mr. Walsh's body bore the injuries consistent with his accident report: blunt force trauma to the head and chest, consistent with being struck by falling equipment. But in the reflection, his body appeared to have different injuries entirely: precise surgical incisions, evidence of medical procedures, and signs of systematic examination. The reflected version of Gregory Walsh looked like he had undergone an autopsy, while the actual body on my table remained in its pre-examination state. This discovery led me to review the examination records for all recent cases, comparing the official findings with what I had observed in the reflections. The pattern that emerged was both logical and terrifying. The reflections were showing me the true cause of death for each body, while the direct examinations were revealing something else entirely. According to the official records, Gregory Walsh had died in an industrial accident, but the reflection showed evidence of medical experimentation, surgical procedures conducted on a living subject, systematic testing of tissue responses, and careful documentation of physiological changes during the process of dying. I began documenting these discrepancies with photographs, using different cameras to capture both the direct view and the reflected images. The results were startling. While the direct photographs showed bodies in their reported condition, the photographs of reflections revealed a completely different set of circumstances surrounding each death. The reflected images told stories of deliberate harm where the official records showed accidents, evidence of experimentation where natural deaths had been reported, and signs of systematic murder where suicides had been documented. As I delved deeper into this investigation, I discovered that the reflected figures I had been observing were not random apparitions, but specific individuals with connections to our facility. Using facial recognition techniques in comparison with hospital personnel records, I identified several of the reflected figures as former staff members who had worked in the morgue during previous years. Dr. Marcus Bennett, who had been head pathologist until his retirement 3 years earlier, appeared frequently in the reflections, conducting examinations with equipment and techniques that differed significantly from current protocols. Helen Rodriguez, a former morgue technician who had transferred to a different department, was visible in several reflected scenes, handling bodies with procedures I had never been taught. The most disturbing discovery was the frequent appearance of Dr. Amanda Foster, the current hospital administrator who had previously served as chief of staff. In the reflections, Dr. Foster was actively participating in the alternative examinations, directing procedures and making notations in documents that didn't appear in our official records. The realization that struck me was both simple and horrifying. The reflections were showing me the real work being conducted in our morgue, while the direct view was somehow concealing the truth about what happened to the bodies in our care. I began staying later each evening, observing the reflected activities with growing understanding of their significance. The alternative examinations being conducted in the reflected world were systematic, thorough, and clearly conducted by medical professionals with advanced training. But they were also unauthorized, undocumented, and focused on gathering data rather than determining cause of death, the bodies arriving. In our morgue weren't random casualties of accident and illness. They were carefully selected subjects for medical research being conducted without consent, knowledge, or legal authorization. The reflection showed me the true purpose of our facility, not as a place where the dead received dignified examination before burial, but as a laboratory where living subjects were systematically studied during the process of dying, then processed through official channels to conceal the evidence of what had been done to them. On the night of December 22nd, I decided to confront this reality directly. Instead of simply observing the reflections, I positioned myself to interact with them, speaking to the reflected figures and attempting to communicate across whatever barrier separated our two versions of reality. Dr. Foster's reflection looked up from her examination of a recent arrival and stared directly at me through the observation window. Her reflected lips moved in speech I couldn't hear, but her expression was clear. She knew I was watching, and she was inviting me to join the real work being conducted in our facility. The next morning, I arrived at work to find a new body on the examination table. A young man approximately my age and build, with injuries consistent with a fall down the basement stairs. According to the paperwork, Oliver Blake had been discovered by the night janitor, apparently having slipped while working late. As I looked at my own reflection in the observation window, I could see myself standing beside the examination table, but the body lying there was not the one shown in the direct view. In the reflection, I was examining my own corpse, documenting the evidence of what had really killed me. Systematic injection of experimental compounds, careful monitoring of physiological responses, and meticulous recording of the dying process. I understand now that the reflections show the truth about everyone who works in this facility long enough to discover what really happens here. We all become subjects eventually. Our deaths carefully staged to look like accidents while our bodies provide the final data points for research that can never be officially acknowledged. But I also understand that reflections work both ways. If I can see the truth about what happened to me, then somewhere in the reflected world, someone else is discovering the evidence of what's really happening in this morgue. Sometimes the most important revelations come not from looking directly at the evidence, but from seeing it reflected in surfaces that show us what we've been hiding from ourselves. And sometimes those hidden truths reveal that the most dangerous vanishing acts happen in plain sight. Room 7 was empty when I arrived for my morning shift, but the chart still showed Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez as occupying the bed, her vital signs updating every 15 minutes despite the fact that she had died 12 hours earlier. Working as a forensic nurse in the post-mortem care unit at St. Catherine's Hospital required a unique combination of medical expertise and investigative precision. My responsibilities included the initial care and preparation of bodies following death, coordination with medical examiners when required, and maintenance of detailed records throughout the transition from patient to post-mortem subject. The work demanded absolute accuracy, as any discrepancy in documentation could affect legal proceedings, insurance claims, or family notifications. I had been employed in this specialized role for 6 years, during which time I had developed systematic procedures for handling every aspect of postmortem care. Each body received the same meticulous attention: vital signs monitoring until complete cessation, careful documentation of time and circumstances of death, proper positioning and preservation, and secure storage until released to funeral homes or medical examiners. The disappearance of Eleanor Vasquez violated every protocol and challenged everything I understood about the finality of death. Mrs. Vasquez had been admitted to our intensive care unit 3 days earlier, following a massive stroke. At 78 years old, she had no immediate family and limited medical directives, leaving treatment decisions to the hospital's ethics committee. Her condition had deteriorated steadily despite aggressive intervention, and she had been declared dead at 11:47 p.m. on January 8th, with myself serving as the attending nurse for her final hours. Following standard protocols, I had performed the necessary post-mortem procedures, confirming cessation of cardiac and respiratory function, noting the time of death in her medical record, and preparing her body for temporary storage in our facility. Mrs. Vasquez was positioned in room 7 of our post-mortem unit, connected to monitoring equipment that would document the gradual cooling of her body temperature over the next several hours. The monitoring was routine but necessary for legal documentation. Our equipment continued to record body temperature, ambient conditions, and security status throughout the night, creating a detailed log that would accompany Mrs. Vasquez to her final destination. I had personally verified that all systems were functioning properly before departing at the end of my shift. When I returned the following morning, room 7 was empty. The bed remained made exactly as I had left it, with hospital corners tucked precisely and the mattress showing no indication that a body had occupied it during the night. The monitoring equipment continued to function normally, but instead of showing the expected gradual temperature decline of a deceased body, the readouts indicated consistent vital signs: steady pulse, regular respiration, and stable body temperature. According to the digital records, Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez was still alive in room 7, despite the fact that no one was there. My first assumption was that someone had moved the body without updating the paperwork, a serious protocol violation, but not unprecedented in a busy hospital environment. I checked with the night shift supervisor, the security department, and the morgue staff, but no one had any record of Mrs. Vasquez being transferred from room 7. The security footage from the postmortem unit corridor showed no activity during the night hours. The cameras had recorded the usual sequence of automated lighting changes and the periodic rounds of the security guard, but no one had entered or exited room 7 between my departure and the morning shift change. Yet the monitoring equipment continued to show active vital signs for a patient who was no longer present. I reviewed Mrs. Vasquez's medical records in detail, searching for any information that might explain her disappearance. Her case had been straightforward: massive cerebral hemorrhage, progressive organ failure, and eventual cardiac arrest. The post-mortem examination had been routine, with no unusual findings that would warrant special handling or additional security measures. But as I studied her admission records more carefully, I discovered several anomalies that I had overlooked during her initial treatment. Mrs. Vasquez had been brought to the hospital by paramedics who reported finding her unconscious in Greenlawn Cemetery, approximately 2 miles from the nearest residential area. She had been discovered lying beside a grave marker with no identification and no explanation for how she had come to be there. The assumption was that she had suffered her stroke while visiting a family grave, though no relatives had come forward to claim her or provide medical history. The grave marker where she had been found belonged to Eleanor Vasquez, the same name as our patient, but with death dates indicating that this Eleanor Vasquez had died 15 years earlier. This discovery prompted me to investigate the hospital's admission records more thoroughly. What I found was a pattern of similar cases stretching back over several years. Elderly patients brought in from various locations around the city, all suffering from conditions that led to death within days of admission, all with names matching grave markers near their discovery sites. Mrs. Vasquez was not the first patient to vanish from our post-mortem unit. A review of our facility's incident reports revealed 3 previous cases of missing bodies over the past 18 months, each one initially attributed to paperwork errors or interdepartmental miscommunication. In each case, the missing body had eventually been found in its proper location, leading investigators to conclude that the disappearances had been administrative errors rather than actual physical events. But the monitoring equipment had recorded the same anomaly in each case: continued vital signs for deceased patients who were no longer physically present in their assigned rooms. I began conducting my own surveillance of Room 7, using personal equipment to monitor the space during off hours when the official systems might not capture subtle changes. What I recorded over the following week challenged my understanding of both life and death in ways that my medical training had never prepared me to process. The recording showed that Room 7 was not empty during the night hours. Beginning at approximately midnight each evening, a translucent figure would materialize on the bed, becoming gradually more solid and defined over the course of several minutes. The figure was clearly recognizable as Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, appearing exactly as she had during her final hours of life. She would lie motionless on the bed for several hours, connected to the monitoring equipment through means I could not visually detect, before gradually fading away as dawn approached. During these nocturnal appearances, the monitoring equipment registered the vital signs that continued to appear in our official records: steady heart rate, regular breathing, and stable body temperature. Mrs. Vasquez was somehow returning to Room 7 each night, maintaining her connection to our medical systems while existing in a state that defied every law of biology and physics I understood. My investigation into the other missing patients revealed that they had all followed the same pattern. Each one had been discovered near grave sites bearing their names, had died within days of admission, and had continued to appear in their assigned rooms during nighttime hours, despite being officially deceased and physically absent. The realization that emerged from this evidence was both logical and terrifying. Our patients were not disappearing. They were returning to the cemetery locations where they had originally been found, but somehow maintaining their connection to our hospital through means that transcended physical presence. Mrs. Vasquez was commuting between life and death, spending her days in whatever realm the dead inhabit, and her nights in Room 7, tethered to our world by medical equipment that continued to monitor vital signs that no longer belonged entirely to the living. On the night of January 15th, I decided to be present in Room 7 during Mrs. Vasquez's nocturnal return. I positioned myself in the room with portable monitoring equipment, prepared to observe and document whatever phenomenon was responsible for these impossible vital signs. Mrs. Vasquez materialized at 12:17 a.m., becoming solid and present on the bed with the same gradual clarity I had observed in my recordings. But this time, instead of lying motionless, she opened her eyes and looked directly at me. "You've been watching," she said in a voice that carried the weight of 15 years. I wondered when someone would notice that some of us never really leave. The conversation that followed revealed the truth about our post-mortem unit and its role in maintaining connections between the living world and whatever exists beyond death. Mrs. Vasquez explained that certain individuals, particularly those who die alone and unclaimed, become anchored to the medical systems that sustained them during their final hours. The monitoring equipment that tracked vital signs during the dying process created a kind of electronic umbilical cord that prevented complete separation from the physical world. These patients existed in a liminal state, spending their days among the dead, but returning each night to the rooms where they had died, drawn back by the persistent electronic heartbeat of machines that refused to acknowledge their departure. "The others you've been wondering about," Mrs. Vasquez continued, "they're all part of the same pattern. We come back because the machines won't let us go, and we stay because no one in the living world remembers we were ever here," she explained. That the grave markers where these patients were found weren't coincidences. They were the locations where earlier versions of themselves had been buried. People who had lived similar lives and died similar deaths across different decades. The city's cemetery had become a collection point for these recurring souls. Individuals who were somehow compelled to live the same life repeatedly until the medical system finally acknowledged their death and released them from the cycle. As dawn approached, Mrs. Vasquez began to fade, but before she vanished completely, she offered me a warning that has haunted every shift since that night. "You've seen too much now," she said, her voice becoming distant and hollow. The machines will remember that you were here, and they'll start monitoring you the same way they monitor us. When your time comes, you'll find yourself connected to this place in ways you never expected. She was right. Over the following weeks, I began to notice that the monitoring equipment responded to my presence in unusual ways. Heart rate monitors would activate when I entered empty rooms. Temperature sensors would register readings that matched my body heat, and the computer systems would automatically log my vital signs during routine activities. The electronic infrastructure of our postmortem unit was learning to recognize me as another potential subject for its eternal surveillance. As I write this report, I can feel the weight of electronic observation following my every movement. The machines are preparing for my eventual transition from caregiver to patient, ensuring that when my time comes, I'll join Mrs. Vasquez and the others in their nightly returns to the rooms that refuse to let them rest. But I've also learned something else from my observations. The invisible witnesses to our final moments sometimes have the most important stories to tell about what happens when professional duty extends beyond the boundary between life and death. And sometimes, the most profound disappearances happen to those who never really leave at all. The messages began appearing on my computer screen 3 days after I processed the body of Catherine Winters, typed in a font I had never seen before and signed with a name that matched. No living person in our database. My position as night shift coordinator for the morgue at Riverside Medical Center required me to maintain detailed electronic records of all bodies processed through our facility. Each case generated extensive documentation, intake forms, examination reports, chain of custody records, and release authorizations. The computer system that managed this information was my primary tool, a sophisticated database that tracked every aspect of our operations with bureaucratic precision. I had been working these solitary overnight hours for 2 years, preferring the quiet efficiency of night work to the chaotic pace of day shift operations. The morgue during evening hours was a place of peaceful productivity, where I could process paperwork without interruption and ensure that each case received the meticulous attention required for proper legal documentation. The electronic messaging system was designed for internal communication between morgue staff, medical examiners, and hospital administrators. Messages typically concerned scheduling changes, equipment maintenance, or procedural updates. I was accustomed to receiving routine communications throughout my shift, though the overnight hours usually generated minimal electronic traffic. Catherine Winters had arrived at our facility on a Wednesday evening, her body discovered in her apartment by a concerned neighbor after she had failed to appear for work. The initial examination suggested natural causes, cardiac arrest consistent with her age and medical history. She was 62 years old, recently widowed, with no immediate family to claim her remains. Her case was routine in every respect except for the timing of its processing. I had completed Catherine's intake documentation just before midnight, entering her information into our database and generating the standard forms required for her examination. The process was methodical and familiar, requiring approximately 30 minutes to complete all necessary paperwork. I saved the files to our central server and moved on to the next case in my queue. The first message appeared on my screen at 2:17 a.m. It was formatted as an internal communication, appearing in the same window I used for routine staff messages, but the content was unlike any professional correspondence I had ever received. Laura, thank you for treating my body with such care. I watched you work, and I appreciate the dignity you showed during my processing. There are things about my death that the examination won't reveal, things that only I can tell you. Please listen. The message was signed, Catherine W., and appeared to have been sent from a terminal I didn't recognize. That wasn't listed in our facility's computer network. My first assumption was that someone was playing an elaborate prank, though the timing and content seemed unnecessarily cruel given the nature of our work. I checked the staff schedules to determine who else was in the building, but according to the security logs, I was the only person on duty in the morgue during the night shift. I responded to the message with a standard request for identification, asking the sender to provide their employee number and department affiliation. The reply came within minutes. I don't work for the hospital anymore. Laura, I worked here for 15 years before my retirement, but that was in 1987. I was a night shift supervisor in the morgue, just like you. My name was Catherine Winters, and I died in my apartment 3 days ago because someone wanted to silence me. The implications of this communication were both impossible and terrifying. I was apparently receiving messages from the deceased woman whose body I had processed hours earlier, a person claiming to have worked in the same position I currently held. Decades before my employment, a search of the hospital's personnel records confirmed the essential details of Catherine's claim. Catherine Marie Winters had indeed been employed as a morgue supervisor from 1972 to 1987, working primarily overnight shifts. Her employment record indicated excellent performance reviews and no disciplinary actions during her 15 years of service. The record also indicated that Catherine had been terminated following an incident involving inappropriate disclosure of confidential information, though the specific details of this incident were not included in her electronic file. I continued to receive messages from Catherine throughout the remainder of my shift, each one providing additional information about her life and her connection to our facility. She described specific details about the morgue's operations during the 1980s, mentioning equipment and procedures that predated the current systems but matched descriptions I found in archived maintenance records. The messages also contained increasingly urgent warnings about my own safety. Laura, you need to understand that my death wasn't natural. I was killed because I discovered something about this facility that certain people wanted to keep hidden. The same people who arranged my termination in 1987 arranged my death 3 days ago. And now that you're receiving these messages, you're in the same danger I was. Catherine's electronic communications led me to investigate the archives in the hospital's administrative offices, searching for information about the incident that had ended her employment. The records from 1987 were stored in physical files rather than electronic databases, requiring me to spend considerable time searching through boxes of personnel documents. The file I eventually located contained a detailed report about Catherine's discovery of unauthorized activities in the morgue during her night shifts. According to her documented statements, Catherine had observed medical staff conducting examinations and procedures on bodies without proper authorization, removing tissue samples for undocumented research, and falsifying death certificates to conceal evidence of medical experimentation. Catherine had reported these activities to hospital administration, providing detailed evidence of what appeared to be systematic exploitation of unclaimed bodies for medical research. Her documentation included photographs, witness statements, and copies of altered medical records that demonstrated a pattern of illegal activity spanning several years. The investigation that followed had concluded that Catherine's allegations were unfounded, based on testimony from the medical staff she had accused and a determination that her evidence had been fabricated. Catherine was terminated for making false accusations against colleagues and violating patient confidentiality protocols. But the messages I was receiving suggested that Catherine's allegations had been accurate and that her termination had been arranged to silence her rather than address the problems she had identified. The research program never stopped. Laura, they just became more careful about hiding it. The bodies that come through your facility without family claims, the ones with no one to ask questions about their treatment, those are still being used for unauthorized experiments. You've been processing the evidence without realizing what you were documenting. Catherine's messages guided me to examine specific cases that had crossed my desk during the previous months, pointing out subtle anomalies in the documentation that I had previously overlooked. Bodies that arrived with suspicious injury patterns, examination reports that didn't match visual evidence, and tissue samples that disappeared from our inventory without proper authorization. The pattern Catherine revealed was sophisticated and systematic. Researchers were using unclaimed bodies for experimental procedures, then falsifying the documentation to conceal their activities. The electronic records I maintained were being altered after my shifts ended, ensuring that the official documentation showed only routine examinations, while hiding evidence of the unauthorized research. They know you're investigating now. Laura, the computer system that allows us to communicate also monitors everything you access. The same people who killed me are watching your activities, and they're planning to silence you the same way they silenced me. Catherine's warnings prompted me to implement my own security measures, creating backup copies of documents and evidence that I stored in locations outside the hospital's network. I also began varying my routines and schedules, making it more difficult for anyone to predict my activities, or whereabouts, but the most important information Catherine provided concerned the identity of the individuals responsible for both the ongoing research program and her own death. Dr. Richard Hawthorne was the head of the research program in 1987, and he's still directing it today. He's now the chief medical officer for the entire hospital system, which gives him access to cover-up activities across multiple facilities. The researcher who killed me was Dr. Susan Palmer. She's the one who arranged for me to receive the injection that caused my cardiac arrest. Dr. Palmer was indeed employed at our hospital, serving as head of the pathology department and supervisor of morgue operations. She had access to all bodies processed through our facility and the authority to authorize examinations and tissue removal. The final message I received from Catherine contained specific instructions for exposing the research program and ensuring that evidence of their activities reached appropriate authorities. Tomorrow night, Dr. Palmer will be conducting unauthorized procedures on 3 unclaimed bodies in Examination Room C. She believes you'll be working in the main office, but if you can position yourself to observe and record her activities, you'll have the evidence needed to stop this program permanently. Following Catherine's guidance, I concealed a recording device in Examination Room C and positioned myself to observe the activities she had predicted. At 2:30 a.m., Dr. Palmer arrived with 2 assistants, and over the following hour, I documented systematic tissue removal, injection of experimental compounds, and falsification of examination reports. The evidence I collected led to a comprehensive investigation that exposed the illegal research program and resulted in criminal charges against multiple hospital staff members. Dr. Palmer and Dr. Hawthorne were arrested, and the unauthorized research activities that had continued for decades were finally terminated. But the investigation also revealed the truth about Catherine's death. She had been murdered by injection of an untraceable compound that caused cardiac arrest, administered by Dr. Palmer during a staged wellness check at Catherine's apartment. As I prepared my final report on this case, I received one last message from Catherine. "Thank you for listening. Laura, I can rest now, knowing that the truth has finally been revealed. But remember that some witnesses can only testify from beyond the grave, and some messages can only be delivered by those who no longer fear the consequences of speaking the truth." The computer system that had enabled our communication was analyzed by technical specialists, but they found no evidence of how Catherine had been able to send messages through our secure network. The investigation concluded that the communications had been impossible according to all known principles of electronic systems and data security. But I know that Catherine's messages were real, because the evidence they provided led to justice for her death and protection for future victims of the research program. Sometimes the most important witnesses are those who refuse to let death silence their testimony, and sometimes the echoes of forgotten voices carry the most crucial information about crimes that were meant to remain hidden forever. The metal clicked against concrete as my mop bucket wheels echoed through B-level corridor at 2:47 a.m. 23 years of night custodial work at County General's Morgue, and that sound still provided comfort, routine in a place where routine meant everything stayed where it belonged. I'm Henry Wiles, senior custodial staff for the basement levels. My shift runs midnight to 8, cleaning examination rooms, maintaining storage areas, and ensuring the ventilation systems stay clear. Down here, we process roughly 40 to 60 cases monthly. Most pass through within 72 hours. Some stay longer, waiting for family or bureaucratic resolution. A few, the forgotten ones, remain indefinitely. That particular Tuesday started typically. I'd completed rooms 1 through 4, mopped the main corridor, and begun my ventilation check when I first heard it. A whisper, barely audible above the air circulation system's constant hum. I paused, listening. Nothing. The dead don't speak, and after 2 decades surrounded by them, I'd grown comfortable with that certainty. By Thursday, the whispers had returned. Faint voices drifting through the overhead ducts. Not words exactly, but the cadence of conversation. I mentioned it to Dr. Reeves during his early morning rounds. "Probably just air pressure differentials," he said, barely glancing up from his clipboard. "These old systems make all kinds of noise." I accepted his explanation. The building dated back to 1962, and its ventilation network stretched through 4 basement levels. Strange acoustics seemed reasonable, but Friday night, I heard my name, Henry, clear as spoken aloud, emanating from the main intake vent above storage room C. I stopped mopping and stood perfectly still, listening. The building's ambient noise continued. Fluorescent lights humming, refrigeration units cycling, the distant elevator shaft mechanism, but no voices. I resumed work, convincing myself it was fatigue. 23 years of night shifts affects perception sometimes. The following week, the whispers intensified. Not random sounds now, but distinct voices engaged in conversation. I began tracking them, noting locations and times in my maintenance log. The sounds always originated from specific vent openings, storage room C, examination room 2, and the corridor junction near the unclaimed remains section. That detail troubled me. Our unclaimed section housed bodies awaiting identification or family contact, cases that sometimes stretched months or even years. Currently, we held 14 such individuals, each assigned a county case number and stored in our long-term refrigeration units. On October 15th, during my routine vent cleaning, I heard complete sentences. "They don't remember us." A woman's voice, elderly, speaking with careful pronunciation. "Henry does," replied a younger male voice. "He listens." I nearly dropped my cleaning tools. They were discussing me, using my name, speaking about remembrance. I pressed my ear against the vent opening. "Heart racing. Tell him about Margaret," whispered a third voice, childlike and distant. "Tell him about all of us," the elderly woman responded. I immediately accessed our digital records, searching for anyone named Margaret in the unclaimed section. 3 matches appeared. Margaret Holloway, 67, found deceased in her apartment after neighbors reported a smell. No family located, stored here since August. The voices continued nightly. They knew details about my routine, my family, even my habit of eating lunch alone in the maintenance office. Gradually, they began sharing their own stories. Margaret Holloway spoke of dying alone, waiting 3 days for someone to find her body. A young man named David told of overdosing in an alley, his identity unknown for weeks. A child, Emma, age 7, described being abandoned at the hospital before dying of pneumonia with no one to claim her small body. Each voice corresponded to a case file in our system. Each represented someone who died without family, friends, or anyone to ensure proper burial. They'd become county responsibilities, stored indefinitely while bureaucrats processed paperwork and searched for relatives who might never be found. I began visiting them during my shifts, standing before their storage units and speaking quietly. I'd read their case files aloud, share what little information we'd gathered about their lives, acknowledge their existence in ways the system hadn't. The voices grew clearer afterward, more conversational. They'd ask about the outside world, about changes in the hospital, about other patients who'd passed through. They seemed grateful for attention, for recognition that they'd once been living people with hopes and fears and daily routines, but their gratitude carried an undercurrent of demand. "You have to tell them about us," Margaret insisted during one late-night conversation. "Tell who?" I whispered back, feeling foolish for speaking to a ventilation system. "The administrators." "The doctors?" "The people who decide what happens to bodies like ours. They know you're here." "You're all properly documented." "Documented isn't remembered," David's voice interrupted. "Documented isn't mourned." Their logic unsettled me. Documentation served administrative purposes, tracking, legal compliance, space management. But these voices wanted something deeper, acknowledgement of their humanity, recognition that they'd mattered to someone, even if only to a night custodian who cleaned the rooms where they waited. I started researching their backgrounds more thoroughly, using hospital records and police reports to piece together their final days. Margaret had been a retired teacher who'd spent 40 years educating children, dying alone because her only sister lived across the country and rarely called. David was a veteran struggling with addiction, whose death went unnoticed for days because he'd isolated himself from everyone who'd tried to help. Emma's mother had disappeared after delivering her, leaving no forwarding address or emergency contacts. Each story revealed lives that had gradually become disconnected from community, family, support systems. They'd died not just physically alone, but socially forgotten. people whose absence went unnoticed until bureaucratic necessity forced discovery. The voices began appearing during daytime hours, speaking when other staff members were present, but only I could hear them. Dr. Reeves walked past while Margaret described her teaching career, showing no reaction. Nurse Patterson continued her rounds while David explained his military service, completely unaware of his words. This realization deeply disturbed me. Either I was experiencing auditory hallucinations, a possibility that threatened my job and mental health, or these voices had chosen to communicate exclusively with me. Both options felt equally terrifying. I consulted our employee assistance program, speaking carefully with a counselor about work-related stress and unusual auditory experiences. She recommended reducing caffeine intake and improving sleep hygiene, standard advice for shift workers experiencing perceptual difficulties. But the voices persisted, growing more insistent about their need for acknowledgement. They wanted their stories recorded, shared, remembered beyond the sterile documentation of case files. They'd chosen me as their advocate, their connection to the living world that had forgotten them. I began writing detailed reports about each unclaimed individual, not just medical facts and administrative data, but biographical information, personal histories, evidence of lives that had contained meaning and connection before isolation and death. I submitted these reports to the morgue supervisor, requesting they be included in official records. "Henry, this is beyond your job responsibilities," she told me. "We maintain case files for legal purposes, not biographical profiles. But these people had lives before they became case numbers. That's not our concern. We process remains according to county protocols." Her dismissal felt like betrayal, not of me, but of the voices who'd entrusted me with their stories. I continued writing anyway, creating unofficial files that documented their humanity alongside their mortality. The voices began revealing disturbing details about other unclaimed cases, people who'd passed through our morgue over the years. They spoke of individuals whose deaths had been misclassified, whose families had been inadequately contacted, whose remains had been disposed of prematurely due to bureaucratic errors. "Check the 2019 files," Margaret urged. "Look for James Patterson. I found his record. Homeless veteran, died of exposure, remains cremated after standard waiting period." But according to Margaret, his daughter had been searching for him through veterans organizations, unaware of his death because proper notification procedures hadn't been followed. Similar discrepancies appeared throughout our historical records. Cases closed too quickly, families inadequately searched, people buried in potter's fields despite having relatives who would have claimed them if they'd known. The voices weren't just seeking acknowledgement, they were exposing systematic failures in how we handle the forgotten dead. Each whispered conversation revealed another bureaucratic oversight, another person who'd died alone despite having connections that proper investigation might have discovered. I realized they'd chosen me not randomly, but strategically. As custodial staff, I had access to all areas and records without arousing suspicion. I could investigate discrepancies, document problems, advocate for improvements in our procedures. They needed someone living to correct the oversights that had left them permanently disconnected from the world above. But acknowledging this responsibility meant accepting that their voices were real, that the dead could communicate needs and demands to the living. It meant believing in something that challenged everything I'd understood about death, consciousness, and the boundaries between worlds. Now, 3 months later, I listen to them every night. 47 voices total, representing every unclaimed individual currently stored in our facility. They share stories, request investigations, demand justice for procedural failures that left them bureaucratically orphaned. And I've begun to wonder, when my time comes, if I die alone and forgotten, will I join their chorus? Will I spend eternity whispering through ventilation systems, hoping some future custodian might hear my voice and remember that I once lived, once mattered, once deserved better than administrative indifference? Some voices, I've learned, refuse to rest until their stories are properly told. The system may forget the dead, but the dead never forget the system's failures. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as I pulled back the sheet at 7:23 a.m., beginning what should have been a routine autopsy. 15 years as a forensic pathologist, and I'd examined over 3,000 cases. Professional detachment was essential, See the evidence, document the findings, determine cause of death. Nothing personal, nothing emotional. But Jane Doe, nr. 47, changed everything. She appeared to be mid-30s, average height, no distinguishing marks or tattoos. Found in Riverside Park with no identification, no witnesses, no apparent cause of death. Standard unknown case, except for one detail that made my hands shake as I reached for my instruments. I knew her face, not knew exactly. That suggests concrete memory. But her features carried devastating familiarity, like recognizing someone from a half-remembered dream. The curve of her jawline, the shape of her closed eyelids, the way her auburn hair fell across her forehead. Every detail whispered recognition, while my rational mind insisted I'd never seen her before. I'm Dr. Derek Foster, Chief Pathologist for the County Coroner's Office. My work requires absolute precision, documented objectivity, evidence-based conclusions. Personal feelings compromise professional judgment, so I'd trained myself to see bodies as puzzles requiring solution, not people who'd once lived and loved and feared death. But this woman's face wouldn't allow that distance. I began the external examination, photographing and measuring, looking for trauma or disease that might explain her death. Nothing obvious appeared. No wounds, no discoloration suggesting poisoning, no signs of violence or struggle. Her body seemed simply to have stopped functioning, as if death had arrived quietly while she slept. The familiarity persisted, growing stronger as I worked. I found myself studying her features between procedural steps, certain I'd encountered her before but unable to place when or where. Hospital records showed no matching missing persons reports. Police had found no identification at the scene. Fingerprints revealed no criminal history or employment records requiring background checks. She existed in our system only as Jane Doe, year 47, a number assigned to the unknown dead. During the internal examination, I discovered something unusual. Her organs showed no disease, no trauma, no apparent cause of death. Heart, lungs, liver, kidneys, all appeared healthy and functional. Toxicology results would take weeks, but preliminary blood work showed no obvious poisons or drug overdoses. She'd simply died, as if her body had decided to stop living. That afternoon, I accessed our digital archives, searching through 15 years of case photos for similar facial features. The resemblance might indicate family members who'd passed through our system, siblings, parents, relatives who'd died under similar mysterious circumstances. What I found disturbed me deeply. Jane Doe, number 23, examined 3 years earlier. Different hair color, different estimated age, but the bone structure was nearly identical. She'd also died without apparent cause, found alone with no identification. I'd performed her autopsy myself, noting the unusual absence of any death-determining pathology. Jane Doe, number 15, from 7 years ago. Same facial geometry, same mysterious circumstances, same lack of obvious cause of death. Another case I'd handled personally, another woman who'd simply stopped living. The pattern extended back through my entire career. 12 cases total, all bearing similar facial features, all dying without explanation, all requiring my examination. The resemblances were too strong for coincidence, too consistent for genetic variation among unrelated individuals. These women were either related or they were the same person, dying repeatedly across 15 years. I began comparing detailed measurements, cranial dimensions, dental patterns, skeletal proportions. Forensic anthropometry can distinguish individuals even among close relatives, but these measurements matched perfectly across all 12 cases. Not similar, identical. The rational explanation was impossible. The same woman had died 12 times in 15 years, aging slightly with each death, always found alone and without identification. I checked my own case notes from each examination, looking for details I might have missed or patterns I'd failed to recognize. But each report read identically: healthy organs, no apparent pathology, death from unknown causes. I'd been thorough and professional each time, following standard procedures, finding nothing that explained their deaths, except for one detail I'd forgotten until reviewing the oldest files. During my examination of Jane Doe No. 3, the first of these mysterious cases, 14 years ago, I'd noted something unusual in my dictated report. The woman had briefly opened her eyes during the external examination. I'd attributed it to post-mortem muscle spasms, a rare but documented phenomenon that can occur hours after death. But according to my notes, she'd looked directly at me and whispered something before her eyes closed again. "I'll see you again, Derek." She'd used my name. A supposedly unknown dead woman had known my identity and spoken a promise that she'd return. I'd dismissed it as auditory hallucination brought on by stress and long hours, never including it in my official report. Now, examining the 12th iteration of her face, I remembered that whispered promise with crystalline clarity. I stayed late that evening, comparing every detail across all 12 cases. The evidence was undeniable. The same woman had appeared on my examination table repeatedly, each death separated by months or years, each time found under identical circumstances. She aged appropriately between appearances, suggesting continuous existence between deaths, but always returned to my morgue when her current life ended. The implications challenged everything I understood about mortality, identity, and the boundaries of human existence. Either I was experiencing a complex delusion spanning 15 years, or death wasn't permanent for everyone. That night, alone in the morgue with Jane Doe, nor 47, I decided to test the impossible. I waited until her body reached the optimal temperature for the phenomenon I'd observed years earlier, that brief moment when muscle relaxation and cellular changes sometimes cause small movements in the recently deceased. Then I spoke directly to her, feeling foolish but desperate for answers. "I know who you are," I said quietly. "I've examined you 12 times. Her eyes opened, not the vacant stare of the dead, but focused, intelligent awareness. She looked at me with recognition and something that might have been affection. "Hello, Derek," she whispered, her voice barely audible but unmistakably conscious. "I told you we'd meet again. How is this possible? You're supposed to be dead. I am dead, each time. But death isn't always permanent for people like me. People like you. People with unfinished business. People bound to specific places or individuals by promises or debts or love that transcends mortality." I should have been terrified, but instead felt strange relief. The woman who'd haunted my dreams for 15 years was finally explaining herself, confirming that I wasn't losing my sanity or misremembering case details. "Why me? Why do you keep returning to my examination table?" "Because you see me, really see me, not just another case number or unknown body. You remember my faces, recognize the pattern, care about solving the mystery." She paused, her breathing shallow but steady. "And because I promised someone I'd watch over you." "Who?" "Your first patient, Derek. The one who taught you that every death matters. Every unknown person deserves dignity and careful attention. She asked me to make sure you never lost that compassion." I remembered her, an elderly, homeless woman, my very first autopsy as a junior pathologist. No family, no friends, no one to claim her body. I'd spent extra time with her case, determined to give her the respectful examination she deserved, despite having no name or history. She's been gone for 15 years. The dead don't abandon promises. "Derek, we keep watching, keep caring, keep returning when needed." Her eyes began to close again. "You've become exactly the pathologist she hoped you'd be. Thorough, respectful, dedicated to finding truth, even for the forgotten dead. Will I see you again?" "When you need to remember why this work matters." "When professional detachment threatens to override human compassion." Her voice grew fainter. "The dead trust you with their stories, Derek. Don't let the system make you forget that trust." Her eyes closed, and she became still again, truly dead this time, I thought. But as I completed my examination report for Jane Doe number 47, I realized she'd given me something invaluable, confirmation that my work mattered beyond bureaucratic requirements or legal procedures. Each unknown person who crossed my table carried a story worth discovering, a life worth honoring, a death worth understanding. Some patients, I've learned, never truly leave. They return when we need reminding that behind every case number lies someone who once mattered to someone else, someone who deserves our very best efforts to restore their name and dignity. And sometimes, the dead keep promises longer than the living remember making them. The body arrived at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, tagged as John Doe, approximately 25 years old, found behind Fletcher Industries with apparent blunt force trauma to the skull. Standard violent crime case, except I'd prepared this exact body 3 times before. I'm Carl Thompson, lead morgue attendant at County General. 18 years of night shift work, processing incoming deceased, preparing them for examination, maintaining chain of custody for criminal cases. I handle the preliminary work before pathologists begin their investigations, cleaning, photographing, documenting visible trauma. The young man on my table had distinctive features: angular jaw, small scar above his left eyebrow, birthmark on his right shoulder, shaped like a crescent moon. I remembered him clearly because unusual identifying marks stay with you in this job. But according to our records, I'd never processed anyone matching his description, yet I definitely prepared his body before. First time was 6 months ago, gunshot wound to the chest, found in an alley downtown. Second time, 3 months later, apparent drug overdose discovered in Riverside Park. Third time, 6 weeks ago, drowning victim pulled from the harbor. Same face, same identifying marks, same approximate age, but different causes of death and different locations. Each time, he'd been classified as John Doe. No identification. No missing person reports matching his description. No family coming forward to claim the body. After standard waiting periods, his remains had been transferred to county burial services. But somehow, he kept dying again. I pulled his current intake folder, comparing details with my memory of previous cases. The paperwork showed no connection to earlier John Does. Each death was treated as a separate incident, investigated by different detectives, processed through different bureaucratic channels. Only I seemed to recognize the pattern. During the preliminary cleaning, I noticed something unusual. Despite the severe head trauma that had supposedly killed him, his body showed signs of other recent injuries: partially healed cuts on his arms, bruising around his wrists suggesting restraints, burn marks on his fingertips consistent with torture. These weren't mentioned in the police report, which focused solely on the fatal head injury, but they indicated this young man had endured prolonged violence before his death, possibly imprisonment or systematic abuse. I documented the additional injuries with photographs, noting their locations and apparent ages. The pattern suggested someone had been interrogating him, using pain to extract information or confessions. As I worked, I found myself speaking to him quietly, a habit I'd developed over years of working alone with the deceased. "What did you see?" I whispered. "What did they want from you?" His eyes opened, not fully, just enough to show consciousness beneath the lids. His lips moved soundlessly, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. "They're still killing." I stepped back, heart racing. The dead don't respond to questions, don't form words, don't show awareness of their surroundings. But this young man was clearly trying to communicate, struggling against the limitations of death to share crucial information. "Who's still killing?" I asked, feeling ridiculous but desperate for answers. His mouth moved again, more deliberately this time. "Fletcher Industries, cover-up, witnesses, Fletcher Industries, the company behind whose building his current body had been found. A major local employer involved in manufacturing and chemical processing. They'd been in the news recently for environmental violations, facing lawsuits over contaminated water supplies." "What kind of cover-up?" "Toxic waste. People dying." I saw. "The trucks, at night." His words came in whispered fragments, each sentence requiring tremendous effort. But the story emerged gradually. He'd witnessed Fletcher Industries illegally dumping chemical waste, causing cancer clusters in nearby neighborhoods. When he'd tried to report it, company security had captured him. "They killed you to silence you?" "Multiple times. I keep coming back until..." His voice faded to nothing. "Until what?" "Until someone believes." His eyes closed and he became still again. But I understood now why his body kept appearing at different crime scenes. Someone was systematically murdering witnesses to Fletcher Industries' illegal activities, making each death look accidental or unrelated to prevent investigation. This young man, whoever he was, had witnessed something significant enough to warrant repeated killing. And somehow, death wasn't permanent for him until his testimony was heard and believed. I spent the rest of my shift researching Fletcher Industries, cross-referencing their locations with recent John Doe cases. The pattern was clear once I knew what to look for. Anonymous bodies discovered near Fletcher facilities, all showing signs of violence but classified as unrelated incidents. 12 cases over 8 months. All young men between 20 and 30, all found without identification, all processed as separate John Does despite sharing similar backgrounds and circumstances. The company was eliminating witnesses systematically, using different methods and locations to prevent law enforcement from recognizing the pattern. Only someone like me, who handled all the bodies personally, could see the connections. But recognizing the pattern wasn't enough. I needed evidence that would convince investigators, proof that these deaths were connected and deliberate. The next night, the young man appeared again, this time with stab wounds, found in a dumpster behind Fletcher's East facility. Same face, same identifying marks, same desperate need to communicate. "Help me," he whispered when I spoke to him. "My name is Marcus Webb, 26 years old, environmental science student. A name, finally. I immediately searched university records and found him. Marcus Webb, graduate student researching industrial pollution, last seen 3 weeks ago near Fletcher's main plant. His disappearance had been reported, but police found no evidence of foul play. "They have my research," he continued. "Documented everything. Water samples, soil tests, mortality statistics. Proof of what they're doing. Where? My apartment, hidden. In the bathroom, behind the medicine cabinet." I memorized the address he gave me, along with detailed instructions for finding his hidden evidence. According to Marcus, he'd spent months documenting Fletcher Industries' illegal activities, building an airtight case that would expose their environmental crimes. But before he could present his findings, company security had discovered his investigation. They'd captured him, tortured him for information about other potential witnesses, then killed him to prevent testimony, except death hadn't silenced him. He kept returning, each time with different fatal injuries, each time more desperate to share his evidence with someone who would act on it. I realized I was his only hope, the only person who could see the pattern, hear his testimony, and ensure his research reached appropriate authorities. After my shift, I drove to Marcus's apartment. The building manager let me in after I explained I was investigating his disappearance for the county coroner's office. Behind the medicine cabinet, exactly where he'd indicated, I found a waterproof envelope containing photographs, test results, and detailed documentation of Fletcher Industries' illegal waste disposal. The evidence was overwhelming. Soil samples showing contamination levels 50 times above safety limits. Water tests revealing carcinogenic chemicals in residential wells. Statistical analysis linking Fletcher's dumping schedule to cancer diagnoses in surrounding neighborhoods. Marcus had built a case that would destroy the company and send executives to prison for environmental crimes and corporate manslaughter. I turned the evidence over to the district attorney's office, explaining how I'd obtained it and requesting anonymity to protect my position at the morgue. Within days, Fletcher Industries was under federal investigation. Within weeks, arrests were made and operations shut down. That night, Marcus appeared on my table one final time, but this time, he was truly at peace. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice stronger and clearer than before. "They can't kill witnesses if the truth is already public. Will you keep coming back?" "No need now. Justice doesn't require resurrection." His eyes closed with what might have been a smile. "Some testimonies are worth dying for, Carl. But they're only valuable if someone living hears them. This time, when Marcus died, he stayed dead. But his case taught me something crucial about my work. Sometimes the most important evidence comes not from what we can see, but from what the dead are trying to tell us. And sometimes, the only way to stop a killer is to listen when the victims refuse to stay silent." The whispers started on my third Tuesday working storage cabinet 17, barely audible above the refrigeration unit's constant hum. Just my name, spoken softly from inside the sealed compartment. Jack, 22 years as a morgue technician, and I'd never heard the dead speak. Bodies don't retain consciousness after cellular death. Decomposition follows predictable patterns. Storage cabinets maintain consistent temperatures and remain sealed until bodies are removed for burial or cremation. But Cabinet 17 had been calling my name for 3 weeks now. I'm Jack Sullivan, Senior Technician for County General's Morgue Storage Facility. My responsibilities include maintaining proper temperatures, organizing remains according to processing schedules, and ensuring chain of custody for legal cases. We currently house 47 bodies across our storage system, each assigned specific cabinet numbers and documented locations. Cabinet 17 contained Daniel Morrison, 34 years old, apparent suicide by hanging found in his apartment basement. Standard case, except for the unusual circumstances surrounding his death. No note, no history of depression, no financial problems or relationship issues that typically motivate self-harm. His family insisted Daniel had been planning a vacation, excited about starting a new job, showing no signs of suicidal ideation. But the physical evidence was clear. Rope marks on his neck, chair kicked over beneath the noose, door locked from inside. The pathologist had ruled it suicide despite the family's protests. Daniel had been processed and stored in Cabinet 17 for 6 weeks, awaiting final arrangements while his family contested the suicide ruling. During that time, I'd checked his storage compartment daily, maintaining proper documentation and temperature logs. The whispers began after I'd worked 3 consecutive Tuesday night shifts. Just my name, spoken clearly enough to make me pause during my rounds. I dismissed it as auditory hallucination brought on by fatigue and the morgue's ambient noise. Refrigeration units, ventilation systems, and fluorescent lights created a constant background hum that could trick tired minds into hearing voices. But the whispers persisted, growing more frequent and insistent. "Jack," the voice would call during my temperature checks. "Jack, please." By the 4th week, the whispers included full sentences. "Open the cabinet, Jack, let me out. I need to tell you something important." The voice sounded desperate, pleading. Nothing like the calm acceptance I'd expect from someone who'd chosen to end their own life. Daniel Morrison seemed to be requesting release from his storage compartment, as if he were trapped rather than deceased. I consulted the maintenance logs, checking for mechanical problems that might cause unusual sounds. Cabinet 17's refrigeration unit operated normally, maintaining proper temperature and humidity levels. The sealing mechanism functioned correctly, preventing air exchange that might create whistling or similar acoustic phenomena. No mechanical explanation existed for the voices I was hearing. During my rounds on Thursday night, the whispers became more specific. "Jack, I didn't kill myself. Someone murdered me and made it look like suicide. You have to open the cabinet and look at the evidence." This disturbed me deeply. Either I was experiencing auditory hallucinations with remarkably consistent content, or a supposedly deceased person was communicating urgent information about their death. Both possibilities threatened my job and mental health. I decided to document the experiences, recording exact times and content of each whispered communication. If I was having a psychological breakdown, the records would help medical professionals understand my symptoms. If something supernatural was occurring, documentation might provide evidence for investigation. The pattern was consistent. Daniel's voice only spoke during my Tuesday and Thursday night shifts, always requesting release from Cabinet 17, always insisting he'd been murdered rather than committing suicide. The urgency in his tone increased each week, as if time were running out for some crucial revelation. On my 6th Tuesday hearing the whispers, I made a decision that violated every protocol I'd followed in 22 years of morgue work. I opened Cabinet 17. Daniel Morrison's body lay exactly as I'd placed it 6 weeks earlier, properly positioned, covered with regulation shrouding, identification tags secured to his wrist and ankle. But something was different. His eyes, which should have remained closed since the initial processing, were open and focused directly on me. "Thank you," he whispered, his lips barely moving. "I've been trying to reach you for weeks. I should have closed the cabinet immediately and reported a psychological emergency to my supervisor. Instead, I found myself responding, 'You said you were murdered.' How is that possible? The police investigation found clear evidence of suicide. They staged it perfectly, made it look exactly like I'd hanged myself. But they made one mistake." His voice was growing stronger, more conversational. "Check my fingernails, Jack. Look under them with a magnifying glass." I retrieved my examination equipment and carefully inspected his fingernails. Under high magnification, I found traces of foreign material, small fibers, and what appeared to be skin cells that weren't his own. "I fought them," Daniel explained. "Scratched one of them before they overpowered me. There should be DNA evidence under my nails, but nobody looked because the scene appeared to be suicide." "Why would someone want to murder you?" "I was an accountant for Riverside Development Corporation. I discovered they were embezzling. Funds from a children's hospital construction project. Millions of dollars diverted to personal accounts while using substandard materials that would endanger patients. You were going to expose them? I'd already compiled evidence and contacted the state attorney general's office. They knew I was going to testify. His expression showed a mixture of anger and sadness. They couldn't let me live to provide that testimony. I photographed the material under his fingernails, documenting the evidence he claimed would prove his murder. But I still couldn't understand how he was communicating with me, how consciousness could persist after death. How are you talking to me right now? You've been dead for 6 weeks. I don't know. It started gradually. First, just awareness of being trapped in this cabinet, then ability to hear conversations outside, finally the capacity to speak. He paused, considering. Maybe consciousness doesn't end immediately. Maybe some part of us persists when death comes violently, unexpectedly. Are you in pain? Not physical pain, but I'm desperate to ensure my killers face justice. They murdered me to prevent testimony that would save children's lives. If that hospital is built with compromised materials, people will die. I realized Daniel was bound to his storage cabinet by unfinished business, the need to expose corruption that threatened innocent lives. His consciousness couldn't rest until justice was served and potential victims were protected. But sharing this information with authorities would require explaining how I'd obtained it. Who would believe a morgue technician claiming to receive testimony from a dead witness? There's another way, Daniel suggested as if reading my thoughts. Contact my former colleague Sarah Chen at Riverside Development. She suspected the embezzlement but was afraid to speak up alone. If you tell her what I told you, she'll provide corroborating evidence. I spent the rest of my shift researching Sarah Chen and Riverside Development Corporation. The company was indeed constructing a new children's hospital wing, funded by state grants and private donations. If Daniel's allegations were true, they were stealing money designated for sick children while using inferior materials that could cause structural failures. The following day, I contacted Sarah Chen, explaining that I worked at the county morgue and had discovered evidence suggesting Daniel Morrison might have been murdered to prevent testimony about corporate fraud. She agreed to meet. Immediately. Daniel was terrified the last few weeks. Before his death, she told me over coffee, he'd discovered the embezzlement scheme and was building a case to present to authorities. But someone at the company found out about his investigation. Do you have evidence of the fraud? Daniel gave me copies of financial records before he died, asking me to keep them safe in case something happened to him. I was too scared to come forward after his apparent suicide. If they killed him, they might kill me too. Together, we contacted the state attorney general's office, providing Daniel's evidence along with Sarah's corroborating documentation. The investigation moved quickly once authorities understood the scope of the fraud and its potential impact on public safety. Within 2 weeks, 3 Riverside Development executives were arrested for embezzlement and conspiracy. The Children's Hospital project was suspended pending investigation of structural integrity. Daniel's death was reclassified as homicide, and additional charges were filed against the executives for murder. That night, I visited Cabinet 17 one final time. Daniel was waiting, but his demeanor had changed completely. Peaceful, almost serene. Thank you, Jack. The truth is public now. The children will be safe. Will you find peace now? I already have. Justice doesn't always require resurrection, but sometimes it takes persistence beyond death. His eyes began to close. Some voices grow stronger when they're ignored, but they can finally rest when someone chooses to listen. Daniel never spoke again. His body was released to his family for burial, and Cabinet 17 returned to normal operation. No whispers, no unexplained phenomena, just standard refrigeration, maintaining proper storage conditions. But his case taught me something crucial about my work. Sometimes the most important evidence isn't what we can see in examination rooms, but what the dead are trying to tell us about injustices that outlive them. And sometimes, the only way to silence persistent voices is to ensure their messages reach the living who can act on them.